The streets of Calanda, till just a few years ago, were dirt streets, mud when it rained. When they'd open up the downstairs doors that led into what is now the garage where you park the car, but before it was a cool place to sit in summer. They had chairs and tables, and they'd have tea there in the afternoons, and the peasants would come in just to look in and see what it looked like. And they had one of the first record players, the old wind-up record players, and my father said he would put it out and point it towards the main square of town and play music, and crowds would gather because they had never heard music before. And he would play them, these different Wagner probably, which they didn't understand, but it was the Middle Ages. Calanda was a town, a lot of those towns in Spain didn't really come into the 20th century till the 70s. At Holy Week, Friday to Saturday, 24 hours, all the people of the town play drums. You have about 2,000 drums going day and night with different rhythms. It's supposedly a religious ceremony, but in reality, this is a town of peasants, and this is the only time of the year where they really get to bring out everything, all the frustrations, all the boredom of the year, and so they play the drums till their hands bleed. These drums become quite obsessive. If you have the chance to be there and you spend 24 hours there from then on to the rest of your life, you always have those drums with you, and when you do nothing, you bring out the rhythms. And in many of his films, he put the drums of Calanda, the rhythms, into his films. Nazarene, L'Âge d'Or, several others. In Spain, during the early part of the centuries, between 1915 to 1920, there was a place of encounter for intellectuals, for students. It was La Residencia, the residence in Madrid. Einstein, for example, would come to give a talk, and Freud, and different philosophers and scientists would come to give talks. And there, my father went to study agricultural engineering because his father wanted him to have a decent job. In reality, he was more interested in literature and poetry. But anyway, he studied insects. And there he met, luckily, a young poet whose name was Federico Garcia Lorca, and a young painter, Salvador Dali. And they became inseparable. They became three friends, where each one influenced the other. And bit by bit, they were, you might say, surrealists before they even had heard of the surrealist movement in Paris. And they did things, of course, they did things also to counter society. For example, they had a friend, a girlfriend, who would dress like a prostitute. And she would get on a trolley in downtown Madrid, and a stop later, one of them, either Dalí or Lorca, dressed as a priest, would get on the tramway and start molesting this young prostitute. So there'd be sort of a scandal. And the third stop, my father, dressed as a policeman, would come on and grab the priests and beat him up and tell them, what is a priest doing? You're always doing this, bothering prostitutes in the streets. Of course, the whole trolley would be shocked. And then they'd get off and then go have a drink someplace in a bar. And my father hadn't met cinema yet, hadn't met the art of cinema yet. So he had a cine club where they'd see films and write critics of the films. And it's only upon going to Paris, they all went to Paris, because at that time Paris was the center of the art world. Dalí, Joan Miró introduced Dalí to Paris, and Dalí had his first show in Paris thanks to Miró. And then my father came up here, and they did plays. He became second assistant and assistant director on films to learn the technique, and finally decided after several years, around 27, to do his own film, where his mother paid for it. And that's how he got into the cinema in France. The idea was a surrealist idea. It had to be without any logic. Dalí would say, for example, well, there's a bull charging the camera. And my father would say, no, that's a bad idea. And immediately Dalí accepted. How would we start a new scene? There's a woman. Good idea. What is she doing? She's jumping rope. Bad idea. She's scared. Fine, but she's scared of what? 2 pieces of rope. That's interesting. What are the 2 pieces of rope? They're made out of gold. Bad idea. There's a man pulling them. Good. And what's he pulling? An electric train. Bad idea. A piano. Wonderful idea. And what's on the piano? A jump rope. No. 2 dead donkeys. Great idea. And so on and so forth. Later, the interpretations were very funny because people interpret, for example, the woman is scared of a man. Why? Because the man wants to come to dominate her or love her, and she refuses that. But something stops the man. And what is it? Well, he's pulling a piano. It's his art is stopping him from going towards the object of his love, a woman. And on the piano are 2 dead donkeys, which symbolize death, which is also something that stops him. Hanging on also the ropes are 2 priests. And that's religion who stops him from really getting to, and so on and so forth. And these were the symbolic interpretations, which are completely false, because the idea was not to have any symbolic interpretation possible. It was like a dream, totally irrational, in that it was within the surrealist line. The projection of the Chien Andaluz was done in a private theater. The Tout Paris, the All Paris, Picasso, Cocteau, everybody, all the artists of Paris came to the projection. And this was a silent film, so behind the screen, my father had set up a phonograph player, the old wind-up kind, and had a series of records, which he changed manually to give music to the film. And just in case, if the public would, if there would be a wild reaction or a nasty reaction, he had filled his pockets with stones. So then he would have gone out and stoned the public. But there was a lot of applause, so then he discreetly threw the stones in a potted plant. Then there was a projection of L'Âge d'Or, and that was different. It was done in the Studio 28 in Montmartre. And there the reaction was that the extreme right, the Camelot du Roi, came, and the theater had been decorated with paintings of Miro, of Dalí, and the Camelot du Roi came in and stoned the theater, threw ink on the big screen, ripped all these paintings up, because the chief of police thought that the film deranged society. It was a cause for starting riots. So he prohibited the film. The prohibition wasn't taken off till 1980. So as you can see, France is a free country. They bought this freshly slaughtered head of a calf. They made it up a little bit, and then they cut it on screen. My father almost fainted when he did it because it was so horrible. Why does this shot still startle people and still shock people? Because it is a very shocking scene, and one figures that they're doing it to them, to the observer. When you see that straight razor coming in and slicing across the eyeball, and the interior of the eye spilling out, this shocks everybody, and it always will be. Charlie Chaplin's daughter told me that Chaplin liked very much the Chien Andaluz and had a copy of it, and he had his own private projection room, and the projectionist was a Chinaman who worked for him. And every now and then he'd pass the film, and each time that scene came up, you'd hear a loud bump in the projection room, and the Chinaman would have fainted. So they'd have to go and wake him up. And talking about Chaplin, my father was in Hollywood. This was in the 30s. And he met Chaplin once, and Chaplin said, well, come, we're having a bunch of the boys from Europe over for dinner, for Christmas dinner. And so there'll be a big Christmas tree, and the only condition is that you bring a present. And you leave it under the tree, and at midnight, we all go and pick a different package, and there are presents for everybody. And so my father thought this was very bourgeois and very stupid and infant-like. So with a friend, he went with another Spanish friend, and they took their presents. And the thing was, they were sitting at dinner by the huge Christmas tree. And my father said, when I pull my handkerchief out and wave it, we both get up and we tear the tree down and stomp on all the Christmas presents. So halfway through the meal, he pulled out his handkerchief. They went to the tree, ripped it down, stomped the packages. Chaplain threw them out of the house. I think they'd drunk quite a bit. And so then a week later, my father met Chaplain again. And Chaplain said, well, come on, I'm having a dinner tonight. Don't worry, just come to dinner. So, okay, no bad feelings. And they went to the house, and as they walked in the room, there was a huge Christmas tree, and Chaplain said, Luis, would you please knock the tree down and stomp it to pieces, then we can have a tranquil dinner afterwards. So they laughed, and they had a nice meal with lots of gin. The Surrealist image was a shocking image. It was made to shock, but they were showing the world images that nobody had ever seen. And they completely broke with the ancient established art, which was fantastic also, but they did something that nobody had seen before, shocking. And it came to a point where we are totally influenced by the Surrealist image now. Most publicity, if you analyze it, comes from the Surrealist image. A piano on a beach, somebody playing a piano on a beach, or a person walking on the sand and the footsteps don't appear. The Surrealist image has taken over because of its shock value, and that's what the publicity wants now. Yeah, I think as Breton told my father, Luis, nowadays we can't shock people anymore. That was his big tragedy. I think you can, it depends what theme you use. For example, torturing a little bunny rabbit, I'm sure would shock a lot of people. You see children dying all over the place, that doesn't seem to do anything. But if you show, I'm sure, a little bunny rabbit being tortured, or a little dog having his head crushed, I'm sure there would be a lot of reaction to that. There was one moment when my brother was 15, somebody asked him if my father did films. Does your father make films? And my brother wasn't sure, because he made these small Mexican films that were 2 weeks of filming, twice a year, and we'd leave for school at 7 in the morning, he would leave for the studio at 7, and since the light in Mexico City goes down at 6 in exteriors, he'd be home before we got back from school. So we didn't really know what he did, and then the rest of the time he was at home. He was a born filmmaker. In other words, he couldn't write. Every time he wrote, it was a tremendous problem. He couldn't do music, he was deaf, and he was he couldn't draw or paint. So his art was cinema. Now what happens if this man had been born in 1812 with no cinema? He would have been maybe a butcher or maybe a bookseller, because writing he couldn't do, painting he couldn't do. So maybe there are people being born today in an art form that's going to be invented 3 or 4 centuries from now, who are completely frustrated, who will never be able to do their art, because that art form, like cinema, has not been invented yet. Cinema was not invented in 1830, it came much later. At the end, he had meetings. Sometimes Dominicans would come over to the house because they were all fascinated by him, sort of like birds being fascinated by a rattlesnake. And he would come and he would start conversation. They'd have a couple of drinks, naturally. And he'd start a conversation. He said, Jesus Christ was ridiculous. It was a ridiculous figure. And these Jesuit priests, these Dominican, but Luis, Jesus was, no, he was a fool. He made statements that are impossible. Love one another. What a ridiculous statement. Since when has man loved one another? Jesus was a fool. But then the Virgin Mary, she was magnificent. And he would go on this tirade about how wonderful the Virgin Mary was. And at the end of the meeting, these young priests would leave the house sort of shaking, not knowing really what to believe or what to think. And he was just having a good time with them. One of my father's favorite stories was that he was on his deathbed and he'd invite all his friends over to say goodbye. But making sure that all his friends were there, he would have a priest come. And the priest would come in and my father would call him and say, Father, I know I have sinned and I want forgiveness and I want to be baptized into this Catholic church. And in that way, all his friends would go and spit on his tomb afterwards.